So now we're going to walk through these 4 areas, and as I said, this will be how we structure the rest of our training. So we're going to talk about first how we as leaders help our people understand these issues connect deeply to our Christian faith. So we're going to give you some tools for that as leaders. And we're going to start with just talking, what does God say? What is God's heart on these issues? So as people, and you are Grace Bible Church, as a church that's, cares deeply about the Bible. In the Bible, God speaks over and over about those who are vulnerable, who need protection. And it's not that God is not a God of justice and want justice for any person. Of course God does. But God understands that those who have vulnerabilities are often especially targeted for exploitation. That's just kind of the way of the world. So as we read our Bibles, you get common categories of vulnerable people that God especially draws our attention to. What are some of those categories, would you say, as you read your Bible? What are common categories of people who are vulnerable that God mentions often, would you say? The poor. Widows. Children. The fatherless. The immigrant. Those who have disabilities are mentioned very often. And there's many other categories, but you get the idea, right? So if God is mentioning this literally hundreds of times in every major part of the Bible, what does that tell us about God's heart? About God's priorities? God understands that, again, those vulnerabilities mean that those who are, for example, poor, who have fewer financial resources, can be targeted for exploitation for that very reason, because they don't have the financial resources to protect themselves very often. And the same with children, the same with those who have disabilities and so forth. So God speaks and God says, I am a God, so like Psalm 68, Father of the fatherless and protector of widows is God in his holy habitation. This is not, hey, I kind of care about this a little. This is who God is, God's fundamental nature. And certainly, as we understand, the Psalms are given to shape our spirituality. This is a vision essentially for who we are called to be as well, as those who are following God and knowing God and walking with God. God calls us to give justice to those who have less power, like the fatherless, to maintain the right of the afflicted and the destitute, to rescue the weak and the needy, deliver them from the hand of the wicked. So as leaders, and so these are very prominent themes throughout the Bible. As we teach the Bible, as we preach the Bible, we have to help our people see these connections and speak with conviction about the dignity, of course, of every person. Our voice matters. I mean, I will never forget, it was one of the first trainings I did. It was about 13 years ago. I did a training like this in a church, and in a break, a woman approached me, and I would guess she was probably in her 80s, and she said, Mike, I am a survivor of child sexual abuse. I have been in church all of my life, and I have never heard a pastor talk this way about God, about God's heart for the vulnerable, that God stands with those who've been abused and God condemns abuses of power. So we were talking through verses like these. She said, I've never heard that in church my whole life. And she said, but when you talked about, that God hears the cry of the afflicted, Psalm 9, she said, my heart soared. And that's what we should want, right? For every survivor in our church, in yours and mine. Now, statistically, for just child sexual abuse, it's about 1 in 4 women, 1 in 6 men. That's about 20% of your church and mine. What do they need to hear? They need to hear our voice on these issues. And it starts at the very first chapter of the Bible. When we are made in the image of God, that's a very profound statement, we know, that we are created with inherent dignity and worth as image bearers. And that's a prominent theme throughout the whole Bible, that it matters how we treat our neighbor. It matters how we love our neighbor. And you can see that in how Jesus interacts with, by the way, if you think of all the stories in the Gospels of people Jesus is interacting with, a huge percentage of them are those categories we mentioned. Because who did Jesus prioritize and care about? A lot of people, those types of more marginalized people, a lot of very powerful, prominent people don't care about them. Jesus cares. And he prioritized those interactions and treated people, of course, all people, with dignity. And Jesus vocally named and confronted abuse. He did this often. Here's a couple prominent examples. We know the passage of the millstone, famously about children, in Matthew 18. I just want to help you, I want to give you something I think it is helpful. Now, certainly this is one of the most stark images of promises of condemnation. You know, a millstone is a very heavy stone in the ancient world, right? It's not maybe as much a part of our daily experience as it would have been then. But a stone used to like press olives to get oil or to grind grain to get flour, right? It's a very heavy stone. It's a very strong statement of judgment against those who would hurt children. Some careful New Testament scholars have pointed out something very, I think, very important. They first note, look, in this day and age, in this context, Jesus mentions that imagery, if your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out. If your hand causes you to sin. It's this hyperbolic language we're familiar with. The scholars point out, typically those images reference sexuality in the culture of that day. It was talking about the eye of lust. That's what's talked about. That's what it's talking about. And the scholars then say, look, Jesus used these images to talk about sexuality. In the Sermon on the Mount, he used those images for the first time. Guess what he was talking about? He was talking about sexuality. So when Jesus brings them up here and talks about harm directed towards children, in the Roman Empire, where there were just common practices like pederasty, where men would keep a boy and abuse them serially, Jesus is likely taking a very clear stand, a very direct stand to condemn child sexual exploitation here. Now, it's an argument, it's a contextual argument. I think it's a very strong argument. Regardless, they are very strong words about harming children and the judgment of those who would harm children. Another one in Mark 12. Jesus said, "Beware of the scribes who devour widows' houses and for a pretense make long prayers. They will receive the greater condemnation." So there's again a promise of very great condemnation for those who abuse power. Now, what's happening in this situation as Jesus describes it? What kind of abuse would this be, by the way?
Authority.
Abuse of authority. We could certainly call it that. What else? It's financial abuse is what we would label it. What else would we call it? I think we'd call it spiritual, because here's what's happening. The pastors in these communities have knowledge of the community, they have access and position of trust and power in the lives of the whole community, and that puts them in a position to see who of these widows have financial means and resources, houses, property, whatever, that they could try to exploit and steal. So what are the means and methods by which they are abusing their power and gaining this and abusing, exploiting someone financially? They're using spiritual authority, access, and intimacy to do that. So that is often what spiritual abuse looks like. It comes alongside another form of abuse like financial abuse or sexual abuse or something like that, but it's all tied up with it. We'd also call it, in modern categories, clergy abuse, because these are formal leaders who are the pastors of the day, who have a formal role. They're using their formal role to abuse power. So just in the Matthew 18 passage and this passage, we have Jesus very directly condemning we would say child abuse, likely child sexual abuse, elder abuse, because this would be elder. I mean, a lot of widows in that day were not old by our categories, but many were. We would call this Jesus condemning elder abuse, financial abuse, spiritual abuse, clergy abuse. Very directly, very concretely. Like, this is happening, Jesus sees it, he calls it out. And so we have, again, when people understand this in the church, a lot of times, again, the Bible, we know it's foreign. It's another time and place. We have to bring it into our current age. So when we see a news story about abuse in a church or a pastor stealing money, like, it's the same things happen today that were happening then. And we can bring it in and help them understand. Jesus speaks very directly to these dynamics, to these issues. I had a pastor one time, I said, the Bible says a lot about abuse. Jesus spoke directly about abuse, and he was just like, what are you talking about? He didn't have the categories for it. So we have to have the categories for it. And when you develop and further the categories and see them, you'll see it all the time. So we'll have more examples of this. It's a lot of our focus and examples are abuse in a church setting, and a lot of it's children. But we'll talk a lot. We've talked already about different forms of abuse. I just want to say a word about intimate partner violence or spouse abuse or domestic violence. When that is connected to a church, almost always, it's happening behind closed doors at home, and it's kept very carefully hidden from the community. Like, you don't know it's happening, and that family shows up to church, and they pretend like everything's normal, and they know how to act at church, and guess what? The abusive person doesn't act that way in front of everybody. They don't want everybody to know. And so very often there's this double life it's that same dynamic but a little bit different because it's being hidden behind closed doors at home. But just to say, and our focus today is not gaining tools about the specific dynamics of intimate partner violence and how you walk alongside. We have tools for that. I think we'll get there with you guys at some point on that more specifically. But make no mistake, the Bible calls out physical violence and interpersonal violence and says there is a way we are called to walk as Christians, and the opposite of that way is to walk in violence toward another person. So there's just passage after passage in the wisdom literature that, again, is to shape how we view the world and our lives and our spirituality. And again, God condemns those who are interpersonally violent toward other people. So again, there are powerful ways to apply that when there is intimate partner violence in a Christian home, and to speak to that powerfully. All right, so those are just a few of the ways the Bible speaks to these issues, and I've tried to give you ways that you can further, right? Those categories of vulnerable people, you can go all sorts of ways with that. There are so many other passages as well. So I'm just giving you a taste of that. Next, the Bible speaks very directly and connects these issues to our mission, I think, and our values. So as a church, so the first subsection there, we talked about God's heart and God's perspective. Now let's talk more specifically about the church and our mission, our values. So of course, churches will have all different ways we talk about what is our mission, why are we here, what do we focus on. And sometimes that's more overt, and sometimes it's more implicit, implied. But I've never had a church argue with me, I don't think you'll be the first, that part of our mission and a core part of our mission as a church is to introduce people to the living and true God, to come to know God and to be a disciple, to evangelize, to disciple. That's part of who we are called to be as churches. Jesus, when he rose from the dead, of course we call it the Great Commission, right? Make disciples of all nations, baptize, and Jesus said, teach them to observe all that I've commanded you. I had a wise seminary professor who said, Matthew, structuring his gospel, is now inviting us to return and reread all that Jesus has said to us. And it's a pathway, a way to be a disciple and to grow as a disciple. And that's what Matthew is, one of the main things Matthew is after, and of course we believe God is after. That we now go back. What did Jesus say? Well, what have we already seen just in this training from Matthew? What is God through Matthew already called us to be? What has Jesus already called us to be? And what has he taught us? He has taught us to be innocent as doves, to be wise as serpents, to beware of one who is like a wolf in sheep's clothing, to treat children well and protect them, or else there is judgment like a millstone for those who harm children. There is a call from Jesus to love our neighbor as ourselves, right? So many profound words, and that is all a part of what it means to know God and walk with God as a disciple. The Bible uses that language of knowing God and connects it directly to these issues of how we treat vulnerable people and how we use power, especially as leaders. So a prominent example of that is in the prophet Jeremiah. In Jeremiah's day, the leaders, the pastors, the prophets, the priests, the princes of the land, the leaders, the political leaders, were very corrupt. They were in fact so prolific at oppression, God says it's like they're heaping up bodies and victims, heaping oppression upon oppression and deceit upon deceit. They refuse to know me. So the judgment of God is they refuse to know God. They are oppressing people, and notice deception is at the heart of that, as we saw already. And that shows they don't really truly know God. Positively, God says King Josiah, by and large, one of those better kings, a few generations before, defended the cause of the poor and the needy, and so all went well. Is this not what it means to know me? So what does it mean to know God? Part of that answer in the Bible is how we use power to protect and serve vulnerable people versus exploit others and use our power for corruption. Another prominent example of this, you remember the story of Eli's sons who are corrupt? Hophni and Phinehas at the beginning of Samuel. There's that blunt assessment that they were worthless men. Tell me how you really think. Tell me what you really think. Well, they were doing all sorts of things, financial corruption, stealing the offerings, but it says they lay with the women who were serving at the entrance to the tent of meeting. Now, let's put it in our modern categories. What's happening here? The very powerful pastors of the day, and especially in this very heavily patriarchal society, had all of this power, and how are they using it? They were using it to exploit, we would say, more vulnerable women, employees, and we don't know this, but likely very young women who were serving. And so I don't have any problem calling this, in our modern categories, clergy sexual abuse, because it's someone who has a formal position of authority, as not just a pastor, as the high priests in the tabernacle. They're holding all of this authority, and they're using that to exploit sexually, to cross sexual boundaries with these young women, likely, who were serving. But notice again the language. They did not know the Lord. This connection of what does it mean to know God, to be a disciple, is connected directly to how power is being used by these powerful people. So, again, those are just a few examples from the Old Testament. Those who know God and walk with God prioritize protecting the vulnerable, especially for those who hold power. And we'll see another prominent passage in our next segment where Jesus talks about that as well. Now, so however we talk about our mission, Every church is going to do that a little bit differently, but I think the core of it, again, comes back to this issue of we're called to know God, to worship God, to walk with God, to be disciples of Jesus. And that is connected very directly in the Bible to how we use power, how we treat vulnerable people, that we are not abusing power. Sometimes when I have churches reach out to us or I talk with leaders, I'll have a leader say something that makes me very uncomfortable. When a leader says something like this, well, we're so glad you're here, Mike. We want to work on this. We know one instance of abuse could kind of ruin our ministry. And I get very uncomfortable with that framing. I wonder if you get uncomfortable with that. Are you uncomfortable with that language at all? Do you have any thoughts on it? I get uncomfortable with this language because I'm concerned when leaders get too focused on, again, what? The ministry. And it goes back to what we mentioned at the very beginning, that we need to make sure we're not a place where we're prioritizing the ministry and the institution over an individual. Because did Jesus, correct me if I'm wrong, did Jesus give any sermons about protecting the building or the reputation of the church? Of course not. What did Jesus care about? What really matters? And we all know the church, what is the church truly? The church is people. It's people. We're a community. We're an assembly of people. And that community involves so many vulnerable people. And as leaders, and I get it. I've been in those meetings where we're talking about the budget or what's being said on social media. I understand we have to attend to those things. But as leaders, when we get into a rut where we lose sight of what's important, we have to help ourselves get out of that rut. And as leaders, we have to hold each other accountable to keep our focus where it really belongs. And that's people, kids, the vulnerable, each person, right? And so we just need to be aware of that, and I think self-aware of, hey, if we're being tempted or pulled down or if we're getting into that rut, what might that look like? And let's be more aware of that. Let's make sure we're always bringing it back to what really counts and what God has really called us to be. That's what really matters. All right. The Bible, we've already seen the Bible say so many things about power, but just here's a few other, want to say a few more things about that. And we're going to do another discussion now. Look at scenario 3, and I'll just take a deep breath. There is no abuse or even danger of abuse in this scenario. Take a deep breath. This is a good scenario. So this is a fictional pastor, Mark, who's a really good pastor. But here's what I want us to think about. What types of power does Pastor Mark hold? So as I read this, think about the types, how we might categorize the types of power that Mark holds in the lives of people in the church. Okay, so I want us to talk about, this one we'll just talk about all together. So it says, Mark is a good pastor. He does not abuse his power. Pastor Mark graduated seminary with honors. He's pursuing a PhD. He is beloved in his church for his sense of humor, his kindness, and willingness to help. He gives skillful sermons that challenge and encourage his flock. He is average height, but his personality and presence can fill up a room. He is not afraid to speak about his own humanity and share about his own vulnerability. Many in the church view him as an extension of their family. So what would you say? What types of power does Mark hold? How might we categorize some of these? What would you say?
As an extension of the family, you might trust him to be alone with one of your kids.
Sure. So there's a familial type of, relational type of power, we might say. Very good. What else?
I don't know what to call exactly, but intellectual power.
Yeah.
He graduated from seminary with honors. He's
Yes.
doing a PhD, but people would see him as an
Yes. When you have education, that's a form of power. Yeah. and having credentials, having education. Absolutely, people defer. When I was a pastor, I have an MDiv, and I say, well, the Old Testament word means this. Like, people defer to your authority on those things, right? And they trust that you've learned things, you know things. They look to you. They give you power and authority because of that. Okay, what else?
Church office.
Absolutely. He has a formal office. He's a formal office holder. So he has positional authority or power, we might say. Absolutely. That brings authority, power. Okay, what else?
Very likable.
Yes, he's likable, he's real, he has power, we might say, of personality, charisma, those types of things. And it gives him, all of this together gives him a lot of emotional power in the lives of others. Certainly he holds spiritual power, we could say. Yeah, so notice there are some types of power that are more formal, credentials, education, things like that, position. And there are more informal, charisma and relational power and emotional power. But notice, Mark holds all of those forms of power together. That's a lot of power. When I was a pastor, and I had a seminary professor say, Mike, people will look up to you because you're tall, not just physically, but they will look to you. That you have physical presence because you're so big. They will look to you. That's a form of power. Absolutely. Mark holds all of these forms of power, and that just gives him so much ability to do good. And yet, what could happen? If he decided to use those to serve himself, they could be weaponized to do harm. So what I would ask of each of you, and we're not going to do this now, but one of the reasons we give you the slides is because it's a lot of information to take in all at once. That's one reason. But also, we build in places in the slides for you to come back and do some reflecting work on your own. And you might do this individually. You might do it as a team, as a staff, as an officer group. But to come back, and I would ask, this is healthy for all of us to do. Just take some inventory. What types of power do I hold? We hold power in our relationships, and maybe in church, in our home, or maybe we have work outside of the church, some of us. You have power in different contexts in different ways. To kind of take inventory of that and to do some self-reflection. What types of power do I hold? What does it look like when I'm using my power to serve others, to bless others, to protect others? And what might it look like if I started to use my power more selfishly? What might that look like? Not abuse power even, but just start to use it in a little more selfish ways. What would that look like? To just be self-aware and self-reflective of that, I think, is a very healthy thing for us as leaders to do, and to have a culture where we are aware of that. An excellent book on this, by the way, is Dr. Langberg's, I think her most recent book on power. The name escapes me at the moment, but Dr. Diane Langberg, I mentioned earlier, her book, Redeeming Power is the name of it, is excellent on understanding these types of power and these dynamics. As leaders and in our church setting, so with this understanding, we have to understand when a pastor crosses a sexual boundary with a congregant, it's not just a sexual sin. There's power involved. And that's an abuse of that power. And it's not just pastors. When a boss crosses that boundary, it's with someone who's their employee. That is an abuse of power. When a doctor crosses that boundary with their patient, that is an abuse of power. When a counselor crosses that boundary with the person they're counseling, that's an abuse of power. When a coach, when a teacher, when any adult, crosses that boundary. So for us to understand those dynamics of power, for us to have those categories, to so many times in churches, someone has talked about their experience and the church leader hears them framing it as this happened, it wasn't good, or I sinned even, and they're the victim. And we're not recognizing immediately, no, this is not your sin, this is an abuse of power. You're feeling guilty and shame as a victim, but that's normal for victims to feel, even when it is not their fault in any way. So we have to have some clarity on these categories and understand this issue of power. Again, Jesus spoke directly to these issues all the time. It's a very famous passage in John 10 where Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd does what? Lays down his life for the sheep. When the wolf comes, the hired hand who doesn't care for the sheep does what? They run away. They get out of there because they're not willing to pay the cost to be protective. Jesus is not inventing this language. He's pulling this language in John 10 straight from the prophets. Ezekiel 34 and Jeremiah 23. Do you know what's happening in those passages? The leaders are abusing power. And Jesus is pulling that language to address abuse of power in his day and age. Because guess what? Abuse of power is always an issue in any age. In the new creation, we know it will not be. But until then, we know it will be. In Ezekiel 34, God condemns the shepherds, the leaders, because some of them are preying directly and feeding directly on the sheep. Other leaders are so self-absorbed, they're ignoring the sheep, and the sheep are getting picked off by wild beasts. And then some leaders just love being in charge and are domineering and love lording it over others. So that's laid out in Ezekiel 34 in great detail. And God says, I'm against these shepherds, and I'm going to remove these shepherds. And there's this beautiful promise that God says, I myself will come and shepherd and bring back the stray and protect my sheep and feed them in justice. And that's fulfilled in Jesus' statement, I am here. We believe as Christians, God incarnate, God with us. And he says, I am the good shepherd, and I'm here to lay my life down. And so Jesus is talking about what does it mean to be a true leader, a true shepherd in the mold of Jesus himself. And that's why the New Testament picks up on that language of shepherding and uses that as a word to talk about what are good elders like. Well, they're shepherds. And Paul and Peter use that language, right, of shepherding and being a good shepherd. Because we're called to use power to serve and bless and protect, not to serve ourselves, not to abuse power, not to prey upon others. And when Jesus rose from the dead, he said, and so here's a compelling way another compelling way the Bible talks about power. When Jesus rose from the dead, he said, all power and authority is given to me. All power, all authority. That's our fundamental confession as Christians. Who is Lord? Jesus is Lord of all. So this is what we can give as a positive vision for our people. As leaders, we can say, God, Jesus, the risen Lord, holds all power and authority. Now, as we've seen, all of us hold some form of power, formal, informal, in various ways. All of us do. Leaders more so than others, but all of us do. It's compelling for us to tell people in our church, we as Christians have to remember, though, ultimately any power we hold belongs to who? It ultimately belongs to Jesus. That means any power we hold in our home, in relationships, in our work, in the church, anywhere, the only legitimate use of that power is to use it in the way of Jesus for the purposes of Jesus. That's what we believe as Christians, because we say Jesus is Lord. And so to give that, not just scary stories and terrible news stories from abuse in churches, but to say positively, any power we hold with our words, relationships, work, church, anywhere, in our homes, and to give the positive examples of that, that is compelling. And that, I think, is a uniquely Christian message that we can bring to our people. that will hold their attention and will move culture on these issues, show that deep connection. And of course, Jesus, when the disciples were so excited, Jesus is going to have visible power and authority, and then we're going to be right there at his right hand. People are going to see us. That's so exciting. We're going to be in charge of stuff. And Jesus says, stop it. You're thinking about this in the entirely wrong way. It's not about being visible and being able to tell people what to do. It's about having power to serve and bless and protect. And that's what it at the heart is all about. So again, the Bible gives us this very compelling, vision, categories, heart of God on these issues of power, so that as leaders, proactive leaders on these issues, when we're safe people, that we would never dream of crossing those boundaries. And we are accountable ourselves. When we're trustworthy, when we're transparent, that drives a healthy, safe church context. Because we hold the most power, that we send the message, all of us are accountable, especially us as leaders who hold a lot of power. And we're going to insist anyone is accountable if boundaries are being pushed, and certainly if abuses are happening. And again, the core of it is you can't outsource this, right? It has to be ownership of us in our communities. And that's me in my role at Grace and my church in Virginia. And that's you guys here in California, right? And so presenting that powerful vision and naming abuses of power and especially demonstrating safe behavior and being exemplary as leaders. Unfortunately, I know some pastors, they can talk about these things in a wonderful way. But I also know a pastor he's even preached good sermons on abuse. And he's said many good things on abuse. But he's also said to his church, yeah, this policy is for you guys, it's not for me. I'm not accountable to this policy. Well, we all know on a human level, that's just not going to work. It's not going to work. It has to be us, not just our words, but how we live and are committed to this as leaders, those who hold power. We have to, and we'll get to this in the last part of the training, we have to implement pathways for accountability when that's needed. And that starts with us again. So we're going to talk a lot more about that. All right. I'll just pause here for a moment. We're not quite at our second break, but I know that's a lot to take in. So maybe just check in with yourself, take a deep breath. Are you feeling overwhelmed or whatever you're feeling? And if you have a thought maybe, something you're processing or a question, let's just take a moment before we keep going.
Passage about Jesus saying to his disciples not to lord it like the Gentiles has always really struck me.
Yeah.
That's a common temptation that we all have.
Right.
And especially, he was talking to his disciples, and I think it was in the context of them not wanting children to come to him in that. I always thought it was so awful.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting context, right? vulnerable kids and this dynamic of power and them not getting that, yeah.
And he says, it shall not be so among you.
Right.
That's very striking.
Yeah, very countercultural, so.
It's so hard to convey the heart of God. People want a verse. They want something specific like that. But you got to look for the heart of God through all of it.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. When we think about education, the way I think of it is we're thinking we have to meet our people where they are. And for some of our people, they already have awareness of some of these issues. They're on board with it. But some are in attitudes of denial, or they maybe even have ingested myths about abuse. And so when we educate and are in charge of thinking about how do we move education forward for our people, it's not always about starting at zero or starting at, 50 and we're trying to get to 100 or something. We often are meeting people in attitudes of denial and myths. So for us as leaders, it's important to think about it is our responsibility to meet people wherever they are and try to help them. So let's talk about that a little. When that is another cultural, like we talked about, the culture that prioritizes the institution over the individual, another just obvious thing that occurs is when a institution or a culture is in deep denial that these issues exist or are prevalent. And I get that we don't want to promote paranoia or being scared. That's not helpful, that's not healthy. But these are issues that are more common than most people realize, and we do have to work against them. So if we're not ever talking about these issues, and so there's a tacit sort of denial that they are there, that's something we have to be aware of. But when we are not talking about them, when we are in denial that these issues exist, unfortunately that gives a lot of room for bad actors to maneuver. When we're not aware, when we're not talking about this, when we're not naming positive expectations for how we treat one another, that just gives abusers a lot of room to maneuver. Now, when I was a pastor, I read a news story online one day about a pastor in my own denomination at the time who was arrested. He was a worship leader at a large church in a large U.S. city, and he was arrested. And of course, the local paper publishes a story. In their story, they quoted a congregant they interviewed. And this woman has just found out her worship pastor who led her in worship for several years has been arrested for actually recording children in the restroom or something really, really awful. And she said, look, it's shocking. It's shocking because this is someone who I thought was good. Now, can you relate to that? Is that, I can relate to that. Of course, even though I train people on abuse, when someone who you thought is revealed to be like that wolf in sheep's clothing, that is shocking. Of course, that's disruptive, and we need to be sensitive to that. Absolutely. That is something we can all understand. I will also say, though, when someone says something like this, well, I just don't believe he could have ever done that because he never treated me that way. Or I know him and he just seems like the most wonderful person, or she seems like the most wonderful person. I just don't believe they're capable of doing that. Those types of attitudes of denial are not helpful and can often be very hurtful. And so we have to be aware of that. And, often it's we who are leaders who have to kind of show leadership at that moment. So without getting into like a specific scenario, it is good for us to be prepared. Like if that were to occur, where someone is voicing this, well, that just cannot be. We have to, and we'll talk about process and, any kind of, process in our policy and protocol. No process starts with presuming someone's guilty. That's not how processes work. As Christians, we believe in seeking truth and seeking justice. At the same time, those attitudes of immediately expressing disbelief, or that someone couldn't have done that because we know them and they seem nice most of the time, those kind of very obvious attitudes of denial that can often be very harmful, again, we have to be aware of those and try to work against those as leaders. And, it's obviously going to depend on the situation of how you would respond to the person, how well you know them, what they're really saying, what the circumstances are. But what I have found helpful over the years is when someone voices something like this, is to bring them back and to say, look, well, obviously we're going to see what happens with this scenario. However, this is often how abuse works, right? This is in fact what Jesus said about how it often works. It's not someone who is openly declaring, I'm here to hurt children. I'm here to do that. That's not how it works. The experience of most people who have gone to church with someone who has abused power is that invariably they were almost always very nice and just like anyone else in your interactions with them. That's how most of this works. So just again, getting that dynamic and thinking about what are there attitudes of denial or myths that people in our church have ingested that we can work against. And so this is another place, and I'm not listing, there's not 4 myths on abuse. There are many. But I think it's important for us as leaders to just spend some time reflecting, are there attitudes of denial? Are there myths that we think we can work against? Or maybe that's more on an individual level. So I've had pastors, when they spoken up and we do the training, the pastor gets someone who comes up to them and says, well, these statistics are just wrong, and here are other statistics. Well, engaging with someone on that and trying to work through that, I think is very important to address attitudes of denial, myths, and sometimes it's other cultural beliefs. Sometimes in church there's this understanding of, well, everything falls under Matthew 18, that you go to the person first. But that's not how crimes work. We don't treat crimes that way. And child sexual abuse, by the way, is a crime, for example. And so, if Matthew 18, we need to address Matthew 18 and how to apply that in a healthy way. Or gossip. The Bible does speak about gossip. But the way the Bible speaks about gossip is about when you're maliciously telling lies to slander someone, that's gossiping about them. When we say, hey, Tony took Erica alone back to the back of the church, and hey, that's not okay, and I'm coming to you as a pastor to tell you that happened, is that gossip? No, that is not gossip. That's doing something very responsible because you're doing it out of a care for someone who's vulnerable. So that's a cultural, spiritual dynamic often in Christian churches. So for us as leaders to just do some reflecting work about that and say, are there things that we can address and whether it's directly or indirectly to help our people understand some needed distinctions if there might be barriers to what we're asking of them, like intervening when someone's violating the policy, something like that. And sometimes for us to, think about how we help our people, sometimes we have to address those in ourselves. And so again, are there things like sometimes in trainings, no one wants to vocalize it, but they're like, I just don't believe that many people get abused, or whatever it is. So I would just challenge you as leaders, if you want to, with some of the resources we have or you can find elsewhere, to resolve some of those things in yourself is a good idea as well. So again, that's here for you guys to come back to and maybe think through together individually or as a group. Now, we meet people in denial and myths, and of course we're trying to bring them forward into a place of being educated. So we're going to talk about how do we think about educating our church in the next segment, but we need to take our break. So let's do another 10-minute break. So look at your phone or your watch. I will see you in 10 minutes.